This is our Sustainable Transportation Supply Chain session. We've heard a lot of great, interesting ideas how we can make our world more sustainable the last couple of days. But these are the folks who are actually going to make it happen. And this whole idea of the supply chain is absolutely critical. It's normally kind of hidden from view. We don't think about it very much. So today we are going to think about it. And you know, how often have you been somewhere or someone's been somewhere and they come back and say, that was a logistical nightmare? Well, these are the guys who know about logistics. So there aren't too many around. So we're very fortunate. We've got 4 speakers this afternoon. And to the first batter, I think, as he calls himself, is Dr. Michael Belzer from Wayne State University. He's very active in the Transportation Research Board. In fact, chairs the Committee on Trucking Industry Research. And I think very interestingly, and it's something you might want to talk to me about afterwards, he put a paper together called Transforming Michigan into a Global Freight Gateway, Michigan to Halifax to the World, which is really turning into a reality with our new governor here in the state of Michigan. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Michael Belzer to speak. Michael. You've got to put that on.
Put that on. Good eye, Mike? Not good enough, huh? Good eye. Okay.
You're articulating it.
Articulating too much. Okay. A little exaggerated. So I'm going to not talk about the gateway, but I'll be glad to talk to people afterwards. I'm going to try to set the stage. The whole reason for me going first here is not because I'm anything fancy, but nobody could figure out what to do with me otherwise. So this is to attempt to set the economic stage. And one of the problems that I have in working with the folks at the Transportation Research Board is coming to realize how little the economic concept is understood fundamentally. So I've been working at this message for some time, and I've made this message specific to this case as well, but it's also a product of thinking about it for a long period of time. Sustainable supply chains incorporate all the costs in the price. This is actually a very important concept and one that is rather foreign to people. People want to get something, they'll go build it, and they just say, this is the way things should be. But in fact, for efficiency, the price has to reflect the true cost. The problem is that the implementation of this is not straightforward. It's a very complex process, and it's, as was mentioned in the last session, it's a very political process. So yes, Virginia, there's politics and economics. So for those of you who know that routine. So to do that, you have to actually reflect the price of automotive and truck fuel. The price of automotive and truck fuel should reflect the true cost, the true full cost. And that's something that we don't tend to actually do. Because politically, right now at least, that's a non-starter. So the people who are the most radical about no taxation without representation, whatever, are actually the ones who are most arguably in favor of a free ride because they don't actually want to pay the cost. They think that they should all get those roads for free. So this is the challenge, is to get this idea across to people. It should reflect the cost of oil extraction, oil and fuel transport, the production of it, the refinement of it, and also the cost of using the highways, waterways, and the airways. So we often, again, don't think of all those elements in this. These are called environmental externalities. The price should include the cost of remediating the pollution problem created by the transport. If it doesn't include the price or the cost of remediating that pollution problem, then there's a subsidy. And so the trick is to get people to understand where are the subsidies and how we need to get them out. Price has to be a tax on fuel use and the pollution created by that fuel use. That's the carbon tax, essentially. And of course, again, this is a non-starter politically because the public would prefer free lunch to having to pay for lunch, which is obvious behaviorally, but the fact is you've got to pay. So the price, if the price reflected all of those costs, it would reduce the demand for fuel. It would reduce the carbon footprint. It would encourage consumers to make efficient choices. And those efficient choices would be the ones that are actually sustainable. So price would encourage fuel-saving innovation. You don't get the innovation simply by deciding you're going to have it. If it can't be supported by price, then it's not going to happen. And here in America, we're real sensitive to price, which is one of the reasons why we're kind of over the top about not accepting taxes, but we're not really accepting the full cost. The price that incorporates the externalities will shorten the supply chains and encourage more local production. So in fact, if the cost of freight transportation between here and East Asia reflected its true cost, we would probably, in fact, have less of it, and we would have a dramatic decline in our greenhouse gases, and you would see a lot of changes that people would say, well, that's good, but they didn't want to get there that way. So that's the trick, is to balance these. There are health and safety externalities. So the price should include the cost of remediating both the health and safety problems created by transport. There's a safety risk experienced by the bystanders, by other people on the roadways, by other people who are using the highway. There are safety risks experienced by the commercial vehicle drivers and operators. There's a health risk experienced by those exposed to diesel fumes, particulates, smog, and other contaminants. It is essential to understand that in spite of the theory, the reality is the insurance cost doesn't pick up. The insurance does not pick up all these costs, and so there's a tendency to overproduce. Again, in economics, the last several Nobel Prizes have reflected advances in behavioral economics, which is really the hottest area, and it's one that essentially posits that people aren't rational, and that's why markets do what they do. If price does not offset these costs directly, then that cost is external to the market. That's what we call an externality, and it is inefficient. The market is no longer efficient. Inefficient markets are not sustainable, and they lead to social conflict, because sooner or later that conflict's going to erupt. Society bears the cost of this inefficient market. So that's when we say externality. The term is externalizing price to the society rather than inside the price of the good, or externalizing the cost to society rather than internalizing it in the price. The winners could compensate the losers to overcome the social cost, but that rolls into price, and the consumers will complain that they're paying higher price, even if that's actually rationally what they should be doing. Markets that incorporate environmental and safety costs have the funds to compensate the losers, but you have an asymmetry of power, and you have a very concentrated, focused power involved in the market process, and you have a very diffuse society that's receiving all these costs, and their political power can't be organized. That's the miracle of the environmental movement, is fundamentally that ability to get past that problem and to recognize that the social cost is big enough and to figure out how to organize to advocate for it. But it can be incorporated into markets, and if you do advocate it, or you do incorporate it into markets, then you see efficient markets where people are making the right choices up front. If our fuel costs, to refer back to the Professor Nye from this morning, if the Europeans have paid double the fuel price that we does. It doesn't like the oil out of the ground costs twice as much, but they tax that to essentially transfer that cost so that there's a great incentive to be more efficient in your use of fuel. And so you see a very much lower level fuel usage in Europe. So it's not rocket science, but for Americans who view this as their God-given right, it's a bit of an education. Inefficient business activity like this is fundamentally unsustainable. So either taxpayers subsidize this directly, or the public subsidizes it by paying the cost of the externality, by more health cost, by global warming, by all these other external socialized costs. Since it's inefficient, that's a deadweight loss. So this is in fact an overall loss to our economic wealth. And I like the pay me now or pay me later rule. You're going to pay, we are going to pay no matter what. Are we going to pay for it up front and make an efficient choice, or are we going to have to put bandages over it later after we've caused ourselves all this damage? Unfortunately, we tend to go with the other one because we like to have our cake right now. Unsustainable activity is both inefficient and inequitable. So this is a way that you can use utilitarian ethics to drive economic choices that make efficiency and equity match. It takes kind of a rethinking, but it really is only thinking back to classical liberal theory on which all of the market model has been based. Either some people will suffer as a result of the activity while others will prosper, which is a wealth transfer, or people who suffer will put up a fight and block it. So one of the reasons why I've kind of been thinking about this, trying to communicate this, is in economic development of logistics systems, particularly ports and those kinds of things. People, like in the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, simply put a stop to their port development for about a decade until the ports figured out, the port authorities and the people who are responsible figured out how to incorporate those costs in the cost of their transportation and to cut down the free riding. And as a result, they've cut the pollution down, and they now have a lot more freedom to grow and develop that's allowed by the people who live near the port. So what's the role of regulation? The role of regulation is to ensure that the cost of the commercial activity, such as the freight transport, is not transferred to society. This should be kept inside of price. So safety regulation, environmental regulation, all of those are designed to place the cost of the hazard production on the providers, which causes the consumers to pay for it, which is in fact the way it's supposed to work in a capitalist economy. That will achieve a socially efficient outcome. It takes statesmen, which we don't have these days, but if we had one, that's what the statesman would be saying, and of course they'd be run out of office. That's why they don't do this. But we can say this because we're in the academic world. But it's an important thing to try to figure out how to get our heads around. Marginal cost pricing in transport does appear to create this market failure. So that's one of the problems, and it's because there's a time aspect of transportation that's really different from other kinds of products that we produce. Without regulation, it appears that it erodes the price. So the lowest paid people, in fact, in our supply chain are the port drivers, the people who move the containers intermodally from the port to a warehouse, for example. They are paid below the minimum wage. They're all independent contractors. They have we see rattle trap trucks that are falling apart and are polluting and are unsafe and all that. It seems that this kind of regulation is absent in China, which is kind of where I'm trying to head. I've spent a fair amount of time in China. I have a son who lives over that way, and I look at it and I try to figure out what's happening. And I think that that's part of the problem. Safety regulation succeeds when the users of transport pay the cost of creating the hazard. Remember that in our way of doing this market, the shippers represent the consumers who drive the price by sustaining the demand, and of course their demand is going to change if their price goes up. Shippers often scream when they have to pay this cost. The truckers always scream when they have to pay this cost. But all that screaming isn't necessarily efficient. That's just what they do because they're the ones who have to bear that cost and adjust for it. As they internalize the hazard and incorporate the risk into price, shippers will create the preconditions for safety. So they're really the ones who are setting the agenda. Even if they don't appear to be setting the agenda, they are setting the agenda because they set the price, and it's the market that they're operating in that causes that to happen. So it's the job of the regulator to figure out how to incorporate that into the regime. Environmental regulation does the same thing, places the cost of hazard creation on the shippers and on the consumers. And that's the way it should be. The price should go up if the true cost of purchasing the good reflects all these negative externalities that need otherwise to be built into price. Otherwise, a negative externality is what we call dirty air. So it's not that complicated. Environmental regulation is not successful unless the users pay the cost of that environmental hazard. They also will scream if they're forced to pay for those externalities and for the regulation, which is very burdensome. As shippers, again, consumers internalize that hazard and incorporate that cost, then they will create a clean environment. And that's the simple part of how markets work. It depends on a clean line of sight between the producers, the transporters, and the consumers. The consumers have to get a very clear signal from the market regarding the full choice of their products. If you don't want to regulate, to control, to sit down and say you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, the one thing you can do is to make sure that price has all the costs in it. If all those costs in there, then people will make those choices. The shippers, the receivers, the consumers, the transporters, the people in the supply chain business, they will find ways to reduce that cost, and we can't anticipate what those ways are. And this is how you get a market to do what you want it to do. Use the market as a tool to clean your environment, not just almost as an accident. You actually use the market as your active tool. And in the United States, in a side thing, it seems to me that the environmental community has adopted this understanding over the last 2 decades or so. More and more and more has understood the economics of this, and that they have to think that way to get upstream of this idea in order to create an environment where their outcomes can be achieved. Ignoring the markets by subsidizing the freight transport may cause inefficiently long supply chains and destroy local markets. So you destroy local production when you're doing supply chain, because we're essentially subsidizing this excessive consumption of freight transportation. So this is where I get real popular in the freight transportation world when I talk about reducing the amount. One of my colleagues that I do work on this from Penn State, actually, he always says freight transportation is too cheap. And because transportation is too cheap, we consume too much of it. And he's a transportation guy, but the reality is still there. Too little consumption is inefficient because it creates deadweight loss. Too much consumption is efficient because the consumers will demand too much, more than is the market clearing amount. So we have too much freight service, we have too much consumption of freight transportation, and too much production of greenhouse gases and other kinds of pollution. The far-reaching economic consequences from this are that we move production. We in the United States have moved production overseas, in part because we've subsidized it by allowing transportation costs to be externalized to society rather than internalized in price. So jobs gained in the freight transportation sector are offset by jobs lost in the production sector. And that's a hard thing for us people in transportation. We always like to advocate for transportation. But if you look at it from an economic perspective, you have to step all the way back and say, what does it mean for the overall social framework? Inefficient freight transport pricing can cause economic decline by causing domestic production to fall too low. Now, turning quickly to China, and I'm probably running out of time, I don't have a watch in front of me. The price should reflect the full cost of the service. The same kind of lesson. This is a great lesson for China at this stage to start trying to think about. Because if you do, you can start thinking about ways of getting ahead of the problem rather than just reacting to the problem. Neither the government nor society, and again, I've already first confessed our own errors, so I'm not preaching. I'm preaching that do not do what I have done, but it's just not efficient and it's not good policy. So neither government nor society should provide subsidies for freight or passengers. If people pay the full cost, then they will choose the amount of freight transportation or passenger transportation that is efficient for them in their use of the limited resources, and everybody has limited resources that they're going to spend. You tax the fuel usage to capture the externalities. That will minimize the supply chain length, have people living closer together because it's more expensive to travel distances, maximize fuel efficiency, and create incentives for fuel saving sustainability. Now I'd like to call on my friends in Australia, where I've learned about chain of responsibility, which is a way they're approaching the safety problem in Australia, which I just think is really genius. We're slowly catching on. I'm getting little bits of people that are now beginning to have this dawn on them, but the Australians are ahead of us on this. So you need to figure out how to hold everybody in the supply chain responsible for the cost of transportation. All of the costs, that means the safety costs, the environmental costs, the health costs, all of those costs, it should be internalized within the market. That doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. It's not easy to do, but in fact it can be done to a substantial degree, and if we can do that, then we'll see a much greater, more efficient usage. So China should have a regulated transportation system that encourages an efficient and sustainable supply chain. If they do that, everybody will be better off in the long run. And I think that the effects will be felt pretty quickly. It needs a regulatory system that applies principles of economic efficiency and avoids these cross-subsidies. Deadweight losses are inequitable. So when you're trying to achieve harmonious society, you can't achieve it if you have deadweight losses that make some people pay more of that cost. Those people, the have-nots, will come back and bite you. They will be very costly. And so the intent was actually to help and could actually hurt. The hidden subsidies in China, I think, are the cheap labor in transportation. We've just seen these strikes in Shanghai. I think you'll see more of those. I'm somewhat familiar with the trucking situation there, and it's a serious problem. You have an excessive pollution is created, excessive workplace hazards, excessive energy use. The fellow from Chongqing, from FAW yesterday, made, in my mind, kind of the most brilliant, straightforward presentation I've seen. It was a great presentation. He says, it's not about the engineering, it's about the market. It's really about the low price and the long hours and the crazy stuff. I've seen those drivers. I know something about what they do. The guy who encouraged me to be in this session is a retired vice president of a major American trucking company. He always says 2 million trucks, 1 million operators, like 1 million companies, 2 million truck drivers. But some kind of, there's a very, very, very decentralized business in China, and that's got some hazards to it. Hidden costs of the subsidy, the lives of the working poor who drive the trucks, the health and safety risks borne by the truck drivers, the same thing borne by the public, the excessive reliance on trucking over more economically and socially efficient modes of transportation, and then there's worker unrest. I happen to know there's a 50% deadhead rate in China. That means that basically the drivers go to a marketplace where the bidding is quite wide open, the lowest price gets the load, they take the load someplace and then they're empty, and they often have to come all the way back empty. This is a huge deadweight loss for your society, very costly, very environmentally unsound. It's because they're all individual operators and it's essentially an unregulated environment. There's a definitive analysis of this. I have this, I guess, is going to be somehow available. I also have a 3-page paper I'd be glad to give you. It's got this written down. But there was a report done in 1996, National Research Council report, that I just think is still the best. I assign it in my doctoral course, Paying Our Way, Estimating the Marginal Social Costs of Freight Transportation. It's very, very good, fair report, and it's available from these websites, the Transportation Research Board, for free. So I got them to digitize this book. This is from pre-digitizing days. This is 1996. It still, as far as I'm concerned, stands as the single most valuable resource out there for kind of looking at this question. And again, I assign it in my doctoral course for exactly that reason. Okay? And I'll put the next one. Who's next?